Melody is a fourth-year PhD student in classics at Columbia University. Her research interests include ethnicity, identity, and kinship in the Roman Empire. She's currently working on her dissertation, which explores various fictive kinships in the Greco-Roman world, including the relationships between foster parents and foster children, teachers and students, masters and apprentices, and wet nurses and nurslings. And so here we are going to discuss the uh, the mythical Greek family of Herodes Atticus. Melody, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in today. And thank you very much to the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference. I'm just going to share my screen. My paper is about the mythical Greek family of Herodes Atticus, in which I will be exploring the representation of Herodes' family in a poem that he commissioned for his wife. Claiming descent from gods and distant mythical or historical figures was a common practice in the ancient world, frequently employed to assert continuity of a bloodline and to legitimize power. In classical Athens, belonging to a specific clan that alleged descent from a deity or culture hero could give one special claim to certain priesthoods. In Rome, distinguished families often traced their lineage back to particular gods, such as the gens Julia, which was said to be descended from Venus. In this paper, I will explore the use of mythology to construct an exaggeratedly divine and prestigious Greek genealogy for the family of Herodes Atticus, the immensely wealthy sophist of the 2nd century CE. I argue that these mythical connections, which appear in a poem Herodes commissioned for his wife's memorial, served as a way for him to advertise his Hellenicity and assert control over his family's narrative. I will first provide some brief background on Herodes Atticus and his life in order to contextualize the material I will be discussing. Herodes was born around the beginning of the 2nd century CE and died in 177, outliving his wife and almost all of his children. He was descended from a rich, if somewhat notorious family, whose influence spanned both Greece and Italy. While the family maintained connections to a variety of historically significant Greek cities, its men had also gradually gained access to the Roman political sphere. Around age 40, Herodes married Regilla, a woman who belonged to an aristocratic Roman family. Many of her relatives had been consuls, and she was related to the imperial family through kinship with Faustina the Elder. The couple soon moved to Greece, where Regilla spent the majority of her married life. Together, Herodes and Regilla, one of the most affluent couples of their time, demonstrated their power and prestige across Italy and Greece. Much of what we know about them and their family comes from the many benefactions they made throughout the Mediterranean. For example, if you've ever been to Athens, you've most likely seen some of Herodes' benefactions, such as this Odeon on the slope of the Acropolis, which he dedicated to Regilla. After Regilla died around 160 CE, Herodes famously mourned her by setting up several elaborate monuments in her name. While most of these were in Greece, Herodes also constructed a memorial for Regilla in Italy. This was part of the Triopion, Herodes' estate on the Via Appia, just outside of Rome, built on property from Regilla's dowry. Maud Gleason has called attention to several bicultural elements present at this site, such as the shrine to both the Greek goddess Demeter and the deified Roman Empress Faustina. Accordingly, Gleason views this property as a space in which Herodes attempted to demonstrate the mixed Greco-Roman nature of his family. While I agree that there are certainly many Roman features present at the Triopion, I wish to analyze in more detail one particular element here, which disproportionately showcases the family's Greek side: a funerary epigram which Herodes commissioned for the site. This 97-line poem, inscribed on 2 marble stelae, is written in Greek hexameter and ascribed to the poet Marcellus of Side. In brief, the text honors Regilla, acknowledges Herodes' lamentation, calls upon Athena to protect the tomb, and warns passersby not to disturb the land. Although not the official author, Herodes almost certainly oversaw the epigram's production and ensured that it aligned with his tastes. I aim to show how this poem uses myth to fabricate connections between Herodes' family and a legendary Greek past. My argument, which looks closely at the multiple references to Greek gods and heroes in the epigram, expands on Sarah Pomeroy's assertion that Herodes' choice to commemorate his Roman wife in Italy with a Greek poem was a deliberate act of sexual and public politics. In the excerpts which I will be discussing, an ancient mythic Greek past is interwoven into the stories of Herodes and his family members, eclipsing their Roman qualities. I will begin with the representation of Regilla in the poem. The first 5 lines introduce Regilla, naming her relations by blood and by marriage. Come here to this shrine surrounding the seated statue of Regilla, women of the Tiber, bringing sacred offerings. She was descended from the prosperous line of Aeneas, the renowned blood of Anchises and Idaean Aphrodite. She married into a family at Marathon. Because this memorial was located in Italy, the poem naturally addresses a Roman audience in its opening, the women of the Tiber. Next, the identification of Regilla as a descendant of Aeneas marks her as not merely Roman, but so purely Roman that she is able to trace her lineage back to the city's Trojan ancestors. However, this focus on her thoroughly Roman background is quickly balanced by line 5, which acknowledges her marriage to the Greek Herodes, who had ancestral connections to Marathon. Thus, Regilla the Roman, in an inscription standing just outside of Rome, receives a Greek commemoration describing her intimate connection to the Greek world. Greek and Roman elements are again mingled several lines later, when the poet equates the emperor to Zeus with respect to nature and wisdom. Once again, as with the temple to Demeter and Faustina at the same site, Herodes promotes a comparison between the imperial family and the Greek gods. Up to this point, the poem appears to give roughly equal attention and honor to Greek and Roman affairs. This equality is relatively short-lived, as even Regilla's own Roman heritage soon becomes rewritten. In lines 37 through 40, Regilla is again said to be descended from Aeneas, as in the first few lines. However, here the poem goes back even further in her family tree, connecting her to Ganymede, Tros, and finally Erycthonius, the autochthonous king of early Athens. In this way, the poem constructs a mythologically based Greek identity for Regilla. Beyond this, the poem acknowledges that while this memorial stands in Italy, both Regilla's body and soul are elsewhere. Her tomb is in Athens, and her soul serves the scepter of Rhadamanthus, a demigod Cretan king and one of the judges in the underworld. Furthermore, in the final lines of the first stele, Regilla is said to be leading the Elysian choirs with Alcmene and Semele, the mothers of Heracles and Dionysus. Therefore, even in death, Regilla is said to be associating with famous mythical Greeks far from her homeland. With these few excerpts from the poem, it is possible to see how the Roman placement and subject of the funerary poem are juxtaposed with, and indeed overshadowed by, the Greek medium and other Greek elements which appear throughout the text. Furthermore, despite this being a poem intended to honor Regilla, no attention is given to her deeds or accomplishments. On the other hand, elsewhere in the same poem, as I will discuss later, Herodes is praised for his public offices and skills as a speaker. This is in line with many monuments in Greece, which are ostensibly in the name of one of Herodes' family members, but give more attention to Herodes himself. The mythologizing of Herodes' family in this poem is not limited to descriptions of Regilla. This poem, although primarily centered around Regilla, also mentions the children she had with Herodes. Lines 23 through 29 detail an honor that the emperor gave to the couple's son, Bradua. Caesar, that is Antoninus Pius, granted Herodes' son Bradua the privilege of wearing on his feet the sandals decorated with stars, which they say Hermes too wore when he led Aeneas from the war waged by the Achaeans through the dark night. Around his feet it was set, shining as a protecting savior, like the half-globe of the moon. The descendants of Aeneas once stitched this on the sandal to be a prerogative for the noble Ausonians. The shoes, or pedila, that the poet mentions refer to the calcei patricii, shoes worn by patricians, which featured an ivory crescent on the straps. I've unfortunately not been able to find any depictions of this moon-shaped strap, the lunula, but you can see the shoes on the screen here. Although the child is unnamed in the poem, in the Greek, these lines must be in reference to Bradua, as he would have been the couple's only surviving son at the time of this poem's composition. It is the description of these shoes, including their historical and cultural significance, which I wish to examine in greater detail. This poem presents a unique explanation for the design and origin of the crescent moon on patrician foot buckles. It claims that Hermes originally wore them as he guided the Trojans to safety, and that the Romans took this symbol from him. The more common etiology for these shoes is that the crescent moon resembles the letter C, standing for the number 100, in reference to the patricians being descended from the first 100 senators appointed by Romulus. However, by prefacing the explanation with which they say, ta legusi, the poet presents the tale about Hermes offered in this poem as a commonly repeated origin story. This mythological explanation connects a Roman tradition to a more ancient Greek past, a practice that this poem engages in elsewhere with the elaboration of Regilla's ancestry. That is, just as Regilla can trace her lineage back to the Trojans and even back to mythical Greek figures, so too can the Roman shoes which Bradua now wears on his feet be linked to an epic, illustrious past. Furthermore, this alternative story reshapes the history of this symbol such that it traveled from the Greek god Hermes to the Trojan Aeneas to the Italians descended from these Trojan refugees. In this way, the Roman patrician shoes are a product of mixed cultures, possessing a similar pedigree to Bradua's own. The lines following the description of these shoes offer an intriguing comment on the adoption of customs from one culture by another. Not begrudged to him, that is, Bradua, a descendant of Cecrops, is this old wonder of Tyrrhenian men on his ankle, born of Hermes and Herse, if truly Charax was ancestor of Herodes, descended from Theseus. More plainly put, the poem proposes the following family tree. Hermes and Herse, a daughter of Cecrops, gave birth to Charax, one of the earliest priests of Demeter at Eleusis. Charax is in turn a distant ancestor of Herodes, the father of Bradua. Herodes is also here separately identified as a descendant of the Athenian hero and ruler Theseus. This family history is important for the poem's explanation that it is permissible, that is, not begrudged, for Bradua to wear these shoes, a mark of the Roman patriciate, even though he is a Greek, that is, a descendant of Cecrops, the mythical first king of Athens. This assertion implies that some might believe that Bradua would in fact be an undeserving recipient of this honor because of his heritage. The concessive kai in kai Cecropidein per eonta, that is, right, even though being a Greek, makes this point clear. Lines 32 to 33 explain that the reason that Bradua's Greek lineage does not cause conflict is because his Greek heritage can be traced back specifically to Hermes, whom this poem has just a few lines above identified as the original bearer of the crescent moon symbol. With this passage, the poem simultaneously acknowledges and dismisses a potential source of cultural conflict by linking the crescent symbol's mythical Greek origins to Bradua's own mythical Greek lineage via his paternal family. Malcolm Davies and Sarah Pomeroy indicate that this poem is the only reference to Herse being Charax's mother. More frequently, Charax is considered to be the daughter of Hermes and one of Herse's sisters. Therefore, in the span of about 10 lines, the poet has either contrived two mythological events, that is, Hermes rescuing the Naiads while wearing these shoes, and Herse and Hermes being the parents of Charax, or the poet has chosen to mention two obscure stories about Hermes. These Hermes-centric lines showcase Herodes' own link to Greek divinity, just as Regilla's divine connections were celebrated at the beginning of the poem. As with Regilla, no information about Bradua's character or accomplishments appear in this poem. Even the small portion which does mention him focuses more on his family history than anything else. Moreover, this honor which Bradua receives from the emperor is not presented as an award earned by merit, but as a consolation gift for Herodes as he mourns Regilla. It is curious that the poem does not legitimize Bradua's acceptance into the patrician class by means of his maternal connection to Regilla, a Roman woman from an elite family. Rather, the poem focuses on Bradua's Greek side and invents a Greek origin for a symbol and honor otherwise considered wholly and historically Roman. Bradua's Roman heritage seems of little importance in comparison. In addition, the name Bradua, which is taken from Regilla's own brother, is left out of the poem entirely. Thus, though Bradoa is technically half Greek and half Roman, it is his Greek side which the poem highlights. This small section about Bradoa sets up Herodes' debut in the poem. Up until line 33, Herodes, the dedicator, has remained nameless. Therefore, Bradoa, as the child of both Regilla and Herodes, serves as a way for the poet to shift the focus from the former to the latter. Immediately following Herodes' introduction in line 33 come 4 lines which heap praise specifically on him. Therefore, Herodes is honored and gives his name to the year. He is included at the lordly senate in the front row of seats. In Greece, there is no family or reputation more royal than Herodes. They call him the voice of Athens. Here, Herodes emerges as an influential figure both within his family and in the larger community. The esteemed position of the family is attributed both to Herodes' rhetorical skills as well as to his royal lineage. While the poem resumes commemorating Regilla immediately after this interlude about Herodes serves as a reminder that the family's fame, and indeed the very poem itself, would not exist without him. Finally, the physical context of this poem, property near Rome, originally belonging to Regilla's family, deserves further consideration. It is somewhat counterintuitive to place such an erudite poem in archaizing Greek language at a site where it would most likely not be fully understood or appreciated by the average reader. Here, it seems Herodes was concerned primarily with catering to the tastes of the elite. Someone not well versed in Greek would still be able to marvel at the size of the monument and at least recognize its literary nature. On the other hand, those who ran in Herodes' circle, other highly educated men, would be able to comprehend and admire the content and style. This exclusion of the less educated may have even been a deliberate feature. If indeed Herodes had creative control over this poem, which I believe he did, then the content offers valuable insight into what he wanted others to believe about him and his family. The ultimate effect of the Greek-centric content in this poem is an image of a family whose ties to famous Greek gods, heroes, and places outshine any other distinguishing factors. However, why would Herodes put so much emphasis on his family's Greekness? The prioritization of his Hellenicity is likely in part influenced by the cultural landscape of the Second Sophistic, a movement in which Herodes was a prominent figure. This period was marked by, among other characteristics, nostalgia for an idealized Athenian classical past, archaism and purity of language, sophistic performance and contest and display, paideia and erudition, and anxieties over Hellenic self-definition and identity. This poem, with its classical motifs, obscure references, and the insistence on Herodes' Greek ancestry, contains many elements which coincide with these interests. Moreover, these multiple links to Hermes, in particular, may be due to the god's association with oratory and education. Furthermore, this inflated display of his family's Greek heritage within a bespoke literary work reflects contemporary elite attitudes about the core elements that contribute to one's Greekness. In Hellenicity, Between Ethnicity and Culture, Jonathan Hall considers how the definition of Hellenicity has, at different times, been reliant on ethnic or cultural elements. Adam Kamezis developed this idea further by exploring Hellenic identity specifically in the Second Sophistic, arguing that Greeks in the 2nd century CE used different criteria to define themselves than those in the classical period. Specifically, he recognizes an emphasis on paideia, an elite literary activity, as key factors in defining Greekness among these men. However, Kamezis also notes that the ethnic dimension in considerations of Hellenicity still remained important in the imperial era. That is, elite Greek men in the Second Sophistic, such as Herodes Atticus, relied on notions of both descent and education to define their Greek identity. This poem, replete with highbrow references and nods to the enduring Greek lineage of Herodes' family, is an illustrative example of this interpretation of Hellenicity as a combination of Greek blood and participation in literary activity. I argue that Herodes used this poem to further his carefully curated image of himself as a wealthy, scholarly, rhetorically sophisticated Greek who could trace his ancestry back to the good old days of classical Athens and even to the age of gods and heroes. Furthermore, returning to Pomeroy's assertion that this was an act of sexual and public politics, we see how, as the patriarch of the family, most of whose members were already dead, Herodes had ultimate control over their collective representation, manipulating both the family tree and the physical space, such that they appear significantly more Greek than they really were. By highlighting or even inventing distant mythical Greek origins for his wife, his son, himself, and the Roman symbol of the patriciate, he paints an ultra-Hellenized and glorified version of his family, going so far as to obscure the Roman heritage and influence of his wife. Ultimately, just as many powerful men had done before him, Herodes relied on mythology as a tool to embellish and rewrite his family's past. While this claim of divine Greek ancestry did not guarantee him any tangible advantages, it nevertheless benefited him as a lasting monument to his believed ethnic and cultural superiority. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melody. What an interesting paper. Uh I am unfamiliar with such late Greek such such sort of self-referential poetry in that style. It reminds me in a lot of ways of early Greek like paid paeans,
Mhm.
like you would get for Olympic victors and things. So this is really interesting to hear about. Um, so one thing I was wondering as you were kind of going through all of these mythical figures that have been attached to this particular person is, in a broader sense, how common was it to get this kind of, self-lionization through the mythical history at this time period in Greece and Rome?
That's a good question. I can't speak exactly to how common it was. I think, from what I can tell, it's relatively accepted to say that you are descended, right, a long ways away from a hero or a god. You get into more trouble if you say you're a direct descendant, like the son of a god. That's a little iffy, but if you make it far enough away, then people are like, oh, that seems a little far-fetched, but okay, we'll allow it. But it's less okay, like Alexander the Great claiming to be directly from a god. That's into territory where people are going to start thinking that you are a little full of yourself.
Um, yeah, so there's a lot of very different pieces of myth tossed in there, especially on Regilla's side, where we have the Aeneas connection and the pre-Roman, proto-Roman foundational stuff there, but also very much, like you were saying, that Hellenizing instinct. So what does that do as a combination?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. There's a lot. I didn't have much time to go into the kind of fraught relationship between Herodes and his wife. She was murdered, which I didn't get to have a chance to say.
Wow.
Um, it's kind of believed that Herodes was not the one directly to kill her, but essentially to get a hit out on her. And so a lot of people see these elaborate monuments that he made in her name as sort of him trying to avoid guilt, saying like, it wasn't me, look how sad I am that she's dead. So by playing up this mourning, maybe, and he's essentially turning her into a hero, a heroine, maybe shifting some of the attention away from his possible guilt and putting some glory on her. But I think it all, in the end, whether you believe him to be a murderer or not, it does have this goal of building up his family's reputation and kind of playing to these ideals of the second sophisticate, making his whole family, even the not so Greek side, seem ultra Greek, ultra learned, part of this kind of sophisticated, illustrious, and very literary sphere.
That's so interesting. I keep thinking of comparisons to to Roman emperors, to Augustus with the claim of the lineage of Helios and all that, and to Nero with the murder of a woman of his family. But obviously here, unlike Nero, who was like, yeah, she deserved it. Um, we have this sort of conciliatory tone, or maybe even sort of trying to wash off the guilt, to wash off the suspicion.
Mhm.
So during for someone of Herodes' status during the Second Sophistic, what would have been the sort of the social consequences in that moment? Like would this have been normal at all? I guess
Right.
I want to know.
I mean, as it is today, if you are a man with a lot of wealth and a lot of power, you can get away with a lot of things, especially if you're a friend of some higher up people, such as the emperor, which he was. So this got brought to trial. Regulus's brother kind of brought this to trial, but Herodes essentially got off free. We have some ancient writings. Philostratus is the main person you want to read if you want to read about Herodes. And he talks about, yeah, some people really disliked him or were suspicious of Herodes, but in the end, nothing really mattered. When he died, people were really sad and mourning him and had this huge funeral for him in Athens. So even though he had some quarrels, to be sure, with some people, but the lasting monuments we still have today are of his wealth, all the great things that he did. Never mind his murders possibilities.
Yeah. So we had a couple other papers in a panel yesterday about the sort of the nature of lineage and inheritance in sort of history building, and in the view of personal pasts and semi-literary pasts. Um, so I wonder, like, do we see in the Second Sophistic a sort of a trend of these things happening, or is it really just this like outsized guys trying to spend all the money he can on it sort of thing?
So, a trend of what
A
exactly?
trend of mythologizing one's own past, of really making a big deal of the ancestry in particular. Um, like you mentioned
Mhm.
Erichthonius, who for anyone in the audience who's not familiar, which this is a weird detail if you don't study Athens, but um, in order for Athenians to say that they had been born on their own land, that they had always lived there, that they were indigenous to the soil, they had to have, a mythological father figure. And of course, Athena, being a virgin goddess, couldn't be his mother directly. So he's technically born out of um, essentially her wiping something off into the earth. Um, and so that very strong association with a claim of lineage and location in this context just makes me wonder, is like how normalized is it for someone to say, oh yeah, I go way back, like where in the scope of culture are we looking?
I can't say exactly how common it is with, gods and these culture heroes, but there was this kind of anxiety at this time for Greeks in this period to want to prove this kind of enduring and unbroken lineage to Greeks and saying, yeah, my father and his father and his father, they all lived in Athens. Um, so there was this desire to show that you were really purely Greek and you could, be connected to like the 5th century, the great time. And so I think Herodes is doing that, but then just taking it one step further and doing something that is familiar to emperors and other kind of high-ranking people, saying, yeah, I can do that, but I'm also even kind of divine.
That was absolutely fascinating. I'm also really interested in the symbolism of the shoes in particular. Why is there such a focus on these shoes? Because aside from Hermes, I don't really think about
Yeah,
the shoes that people are wearing in ancient Greece and Rome in the mythology. It doesn't come up a lot.
Mhm. The shoes are interesting. I'm so upset I couldn't find an actual depiction of this kind of lunula. But yeah, they're weird. There's another passage from Philostratus where Herodes kind of makes fun of Regilla's brother, who's also named Bradua, kind of making fun of his shoes. So I don't know if Herodes is kind of trying to take away the Romanness of it and say, well, it's actually a Greek thing, so it's not even that impressive for you. Like it comes from us. Um, yeah, it's such a strange rewriting of this history.
That's that's very funny. And honestly, I think I've seen that kind of trend of like, oh well, I have to get on top of all of these weird rumors that people say about me and my family in public poetry. So which I believe today we call it the Streisand effect. Uh, all right. Well, I believe it is time to move on to our next presentation. Thank you so much, Melody, for that fascinating talk. There is some applause going on in the chat, and we really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.